Good morning, everybody in the UK, and good afternoon to everybody in ASEAN. And I welcome you to another one of our In Conversation webinars. My name is Paul North from the UK-ASEAN Business Council. And today we have some special guests in the way of Tim Rockell from Energy Strat Asia. We have two colleagues from Energy Industries Council, Nashina Liang and Herzi Iskander. And we also are joined by Michelle, who's a partner with Reed Smith. And we'll all be introducing ourselves very, very shortly. But just to let you know that you can send in at any time questions through the question box in the lower right-hand corner of the webinar dashboard. And we will endeavour to answer those during the webinar. At the end of the webinar, if we do run out of time, then we certainly will get back to you and answer your questions. So just to start by saying that we at UK-ASEAN Business Council help companies of all sizes build new contacts, provide market insights, raise the awareness of the vast commercial opportunities in what is the fastest growing region in the world. And we also bring ASEAN to the UK through a sustained calendar of events. So watch this space. There's a huge amount of information on our website, ukabc.org.uk, including all our forthcoming events program. So today's webinar is about ASEAN's Renewable Energy Challenge, opportunities for UK companies. And yes, I'd like to introduce our colleagues on the webinar. Good afternoon, guys. I think we have a little bit of a challenge today, as we are in 3 different countries and 4 locations, but hopefully we'll be able to pull this all together. So look, if I could just ask each of you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your organisation and what that does. Shall we start with you, Tim?
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to the UK-ASEAN Business Council for this short webcast, and I quite like the format of it. Before I start, I just wanted to say a word on the virus. Certainly the headlines you've been seeing in the UK and Europe today are pretty much what we've been living with for the last number of weeks, and I think, we shouldn't, be kind of too obsessed with the short term. I mean, there is going to be an impact, but the longer term trend remains, and that's why I set up Energy Strat Asia. My career, I've spent 7 years in Singapore, 7 years in the Middle East, working with large energy, power, infrastructure, natural resource players, across oil and gas all the way to electricity. And I set up Energy Strat Asia really to be the business development director on the ground here in Asia for companies in the UK looking to build a presence in the region. So helping with export strategies, helping you get clients, and even helping set up locally and get investments. That's all things that we could do. And I'm very pleased that Energy Industries Council and Bree from Reed Smith, Bree's actually the co-chair alongside myself on the BritCham Energy and Utilities Business Group. And I know that Energy Industry Council also plays a role in the Myanmar branch of BritCham. So we've got a good panel for you today. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Paul. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for Tim. Nashina, would you like to introduce yourself and just give us an overview of EIC?
All right, thank you so much, Paul. Welcome, everyone. Good morning to those in Europe and good afternoon to all in Asia. I would like to also thank UK-ABC for actually inviting us to speak, as well as Tim from Energy Strat Asia. So for those who are not familiar with the Energy Industries Council, just a brief introduction. Basically, EIC is a not-for-profit energy trade association. Our main function is to support supply chain companies to maximize business opportunities and to assist them in making connections with key operators and contractors across the energy sectors. We also help our members to identify where global business opportunity exists. Besides that, we also provide networking platforms for companies to meet the right contacts in the industry And one of our events that is actually coming up in March 26, next month, is our flagship Connect event. If you don't mind to switch to the next slide, Paul. This will be held in Jakarta, Indonesia. And this is actually a great opportunity for companies to meet up with the operators as well as the main contractors in Indonesia. So if there's any inquiries regarding this particular event, feel free to email me and my colleague Hirzi. Yeah, I think that's all from me. Back at you, Paul.
Thanks you very much, Nshina. Bree, if you are there, if you could just do an overview of yourself and Reed Smith, please.
Thanks very much, Paul. So my name's Bree Michel. I'm a partner with Reed Smith, which is a global law firm. We are headquartered in the United States. However, our largest office is in London. We provide legal services globally, and one core focus of the firm is energy and natural resources. I'm based out of our Singapore office, and I've been involved advising clients on their investment and development of renewable energy projects, not only in Asia, but prior to that market really getting going in Asia, in the UK, throughout Africa, and even in Europe. I'll hand back to you, Paul.
Excellent, thank you very much. So, our listeners want to know about the renewable landscape in ASEAN. So, yeah, if you could give us some kind of an idea of what that is looking like in ASEAN. And again, shall I kick off with you again, I think, Tim?
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. And I'll be brief so that I allow everybody else a chance to speak. I mean, I think one thing's very important. ASEAN, it really is, the next China, the next India as part of your Asian strategy. 720 million people and a huge need to build out energy in a way that, is decarbonising the planet. Now, of course, those of you who know the region will know that, there's a lot of coal, there's a lot of gas and renewable energy. We're seeing build outs of solar, we're seeing wind, both offshore wind in North Asia, but typically in ASEAN, we're seeing some onshore wind projects coming up in Vietnam. And we're also seeing some interesting developments in Singapore. So Singapore is a city where good things are happening. We're seeing lots of low carbon alternatives. Most of the electricity here is produced by gas, but there is a 2 gigawatt solar target by 2030. So the government's putting a lot of effort into the renewable energy space. It's restricted, of course, by land. So it's really looking for innovative technologies, innovative solutions, how to maximize performance of solar panels. So people who have got technologies that really help the performance of these renewable energy technologies, I would say there's a very good market for you here. And that extends into areas such as energy efficiency and the whole thing around districtization, city zoning and digitalization. So it's a very vibrant scene. ASEAN's full of mega cities. There's still, I haven't mentioned, there are many people who haven't got any electricity at all. And on the archipelago geography, there's a lot of diesel generation that's looking to be replaced with renewable and storage kit. So each country is different, and we can get a bit into that a little bit later on. But that, I hope, paints a very good picture of the ASEAN landscape.
Is there anything you can add to that, Nasheen?
So I would like to echo on Tim regarding the Southeast Asia region. It is still very much heavily dependent on fossil fuel. But the region is still really keen to actually transition to cleaner energy, which is gas and renewables. So these countries have already set their targets for the growth in renewables. So such as Indonesia, who is hoping to achieve 23% of renewable energy into its energy mix by 2025, as well as Vietnam, who is targeting 23% by 2030. We'll be going into this more detail later on in this webinar. And Paul, if you don't mind to go through the slides, please. Thank you. So So these countries are very actively seeking for support from more experienced market as well as foreign investment. And Indonesia, as an example, has projected a 17 billion investment in its renewable sector for the course of 5 years. And the country actually greatly encourages foreign investment to boost the country's renewable sector. So another one of the major sector of growth that we are seeing in the region is basically offshore wind, which is primarily we see in China, which is the leader of the Southeast Asia, the leader of the pack. Among them is Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam is also very much involved in this particular sector. And China actually in the pipeline has about 43 gigawatts that has been permitted, projects that had been permitted, whereas Taiwan, which is the second largest offshore wind market in the region, has a total of 5.5 gigawatts in the pipeline. So these future capacities basically indicates how vast the offshore wind opportunities is in the this part of this region. And we are also seeing the fall in the cost of renewable energy, especially in the solar and onshore wind sector, which are very cost effective. And growth can be greatly seen in countries in the region, such as Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. It is also worth noting that Vietnam is actually now the leader in Southeast Asia's solar PV market with about 5 gigawatts of installed capacity. This actually makes it 44% of the region's total installed solar capacity. And furthermore, to highlight another sector, we are seeing some movement in a relatively new technology in Southeast Asia. Since this region, we have some land constraints issue. So we are seeing floating solar sector in countries such as Indonesia and Vietnam moving forward. So basically speaking, it is the future of renewables in the Southeast Asia region is very bright, and we are looking forward to more investment as well as development in this particular sector in the future. So yeah, back to you, Paul.
Lovely. Bree, what else could you add to that?
I don't want to tread over, I know, upcoming questions, but I guess what I'd like to say is I think things are looking up, and there's certainly a lot of activity happening, a lot of, particularly in the M&A space that we're seeing on the legal side of things. There are a lot of difficulties that surround these targets across these countries. But what we're seeing, I think now, is countries actually putting in place how they're going to achieve those targets. So, for example, yes, we've had this incredible success and boom in the growth in solar in Vietnam over the last 12 to 18 months. However, there's been a lot of risk involved that's had to be borne by local banks and international investors in respect of those markets, and some of those risks have been realised because the basis of the offtake of electricity from those projects has been on a take and pay basis, not I guess the traditional take or pay basis, which protects and sort of insulates investors in those markets. This has led to sort of a bit of a slowdown in deals in those markets, which has now been mitigated by the government's plans to move forward with an auction scheme and to take the assistance of the International Financial Corporation and the Asian Development Bank. So we're hoping we're actually going to transition to something that, while the headline returns for investors will look lower, in fact, they'll be far more reliable and bankable, and something that international investors can get more comfortable with. We've seen that in neighbouring Cambodia in the last 6 months as well, with their very successful Asian Development Bank-backed auction program as well. So I think where we've come from in the region is sort of quite a grey place where people have had to find their own way. To be successful partners, investors have had to have quite a significant risk appetite and access to funds that weren't as risk adverse as international commercial banks are, per se. But I think the market's becoming more sophisticated. Some of the local players, so if you look at the Chinese investors and the Chinese EPC contractors who were going in and backing a lot of these deals previously, they're also now looking to ensure that the deal stands up from a commercial perspective. The big successes we've seen around the region, headline deals like the Equus sell-off a couple of years ago. Now, the majority of the portfolio of assets was actually located in jurisdictions like Japan, which were seen as lower risk jurisdictions, and that did have did meet sniff test from a bankability standpoint for investors and international banks. That's again what we see in Taiwan too as well. You know, you've got a low risk jurisdiction. ASEAN is just finding its way now into, I think, a more bankable and stable market.
Good. I mean, maybe we could look to see how these targets are going to be achieved and what the challenges are, because Nashina mentioned some targets there for Vietnam, for instance, and Indonesia, and ASEAN as a whole is trying to secure 23% of its primary energy from renewable sources within the next 5 years. So it's a huge challenge. Singapore are looking at putting solar on, as we know. Malaysia, 20% of renewables by 2030. So some huge targets there to be achieved. So it'd be great to get some insight from you on what you feel about those and what you feel the challenges for those countries will be.
Perhaps if I jump in here quickly, Paul, and then hand over to others briefly. I think you mentioned ASEAN, but each country is different in many ways, and some of the targets that we saw mentioned for Indonesia, are very aggressive, and some would say unlikely to achieve them. That doesn't mean that nothing is happening, and I think Nashima mentioned Vietnam is currently going gangbusters, but we are seeing people in all countries in ASEAN looking at different technologies, different solutions, and different ways of obtaining finance. And a number of the big international players are based out of Singapore, looking at different markets. There's some overlap, but some are looking at their own markets as well. So when you actually pick which country, you need to take in a number of different understanding as to kind of who's playing in each location. But there's plenty going on. Don't be surprised if we talk about North Asia. We've mentioned China. I think we mentioned Taiwan, Korea. There's a lot of these projects which are being driven out of Singapore. So Singapore, I would say, is emerging as a hub of professional, legal, technical competence. And so that's why sometimes, when even on an ASEAN call, we talk about some of these North Asian countries.
Yeah, that's interesting to note as well, that Singapore is becoming that hub and could be a steer for organisations. Anybody else got some additions to add to that?
Since we'll be talking about challenges, I feel like countries in Southeast Asia, basically this region is they have lack of experience and expertise. Namely, just to name a few, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, they have a lack of experience and expertise in, for example, evaluating the risk of renewable energy investment. And besides that, countries like Indonesia and Philippines, they are having challenges in terms of having limited infrastructure capacities, which actually greatly hinders this effective renewable energy deployment in regards to electricity transmission. So
I think that's the point about what we've. Oh, sorry, Nashina, I don't want to overrun you there. But I think that the point that you're making is exactly what we've seen play out in Vietnam. You've seen a very high headline feed-in tariff rate. People jump into that market, but the transmission infrastructure wasn't in place. And because those offtake agreements were done on a take and pay basis, what you've ended up is a situation where these solar projects have been curtailed between 35-68%, and the investor has had to wear that downgrade without the offtake, without the government stepping in and making them whole. So I think it is a little bit of a, sort of one step forward, two step back, as the infrastructure and the expertise is developed within those markets. And I think, if you look where Malaysia is now, they're currently going through large-scale solar 3 auction process and looking at the tenders there, and you can see where they've come. But they've got a very well-structured program, very sophisticated, and you can see that learning there. You compare that to Indonesia with continuous regulatory change, where parties have been looking to invest in the development of projects in particular regions, gearing up based on a regulatory program that's announced by the government, only to then have the government change it. I think, where we've seen success is where we've had stability, where investors have been able to make their decision based on information and based on a framework that's going to continue.
I think that brings us actually nicely on, because Nashina mentioned sort of some of the opportunities that might be available there. But yeah, it's great to hear all that of what is going to be achieved and what the challenges are. And of course, that does bring some opportunities for our UK companies in their renewable business. So if I could just hear from you what you believe to be the opportunities for our companies here in the UK and how they can access that renewable business.
Okay, so Tim here, if I make a start, I think, think about population growth. I mentioned the number of 720 million earlier. That's a projection to 2030. And so you're seeing huge middle classes. So it's the whole gamut, really. It's all the smart grid, microgrid, looking at energy nexus, waste to energy projects. Companies like EDF, Engie, Siemens, Rolls-Royce, GE, they're all here already. So there's plenty of room to play up and down the supply chains. There is a question that's coming, I think, on multilaterals. They're here as well. World Bank is in Singapore. ADB has just set up an office this year. So there's a huge multilateral development bank. And also not forgetting, of course, the UK Prosperity Fund. There's some good studies going on in the region. There's a Belt and Road outbound from China into the region project. There's a renewable energy project looking at 6 of the big ASEAN countries, and there's just starting an East Indonesia project as well. So there's lots being driven, by the British government, and lots being driven at different levels. So I hope that gives a kind of quick insight.
Lovely. Anything else to add to that, Nasheen?
So just to highlight some opportunities, basically that is, I believe, is relevant for foreign companies to actually be involved in. As what Bree mentioned earlier on, Malaysia had actually tendered out a 500 megawatts project, which is called the large-scale solar projects. So basically, they had actually awarded the contracts to five developers, and I believe that this 500 megawatts project, which is broken down into 5 projects, is quite a good opportunity for companies to perhaps look for a way to get into these projects. And in Indonesia, I would like also to highlight that the Indonesian government is planning to auction 5 geothermal working areas in 2020 after they actually implemented their new regulation for their feed-in tariff scheme. So this is also an arena that companies should actually look into in terms of renewables side of things.
Just adding to that as well, in Vietnam, there's anticipated to be a pilot auction for floating solar PV later this year and next year of 400 megawatts, and the Philippines is looking to also launch an auction for renewable capacity.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Bree. I mean, it's some great opportunities by the sounds of it. Our companies will want to know how to get into that marketplace. I mean, if I could ask each of you in turn, just to give our companies a little bit of top tips, really, and advice on what they need to do now and how they can pursue these opportunities in ASEAN.
Okay, let me go first, and then others, please fill in plenty of gaps I'm sure that I'll make. But I would say that, you know, ASEAN, you know, it should be part of your export strategy. It should be part of the markets that you're looking at. You have to make choices. Singapore is a good place to make those choices from. But alternatively, there's nothing to stop you picking one or two countries and going in direct. There's plenty of support that can help you do that. It's a bit akin to companies setting up in Dubai and serving the Middle East. There's lots of research that's already being done, and there's more that's being underway. So feel free to reach out and ask for some of that. Don't be put off by any of the kind of the short-term coronavirus impacts that I mentioned earlier. Be aware of risks. There are plenty of risks around payments, currency, risk allocation, foreign exchange. These are all things that you have to deal with in these markets, and ASEAN is no exception. And also, you know, to get some of the grants and tax incentives that are available, find local partners. You know, there's help out here as well that you can tap into local players, and that will access some of the grants and incentives that are available in some of the countries as well.
Excellent. I'm sure, Nasheen, there's some good advice there from EIC, I think, as well, for companies looking to get into that place.
All right. I think Tim had actually covered it pretty thorough, and just to add a bit on top of what Tim had mentioned, just to echo as well what he had mentioned, it is best to actually collaborate with local players in the country, because countries such as Indonesia, I believe we know that they are actually quite fond in local content. So I feel like this is a big part of in terms of how companies want to go into like the Indonesia to do business with them. And also it's best to actually familiarize yourself as well with the regulations and policies, the government targets. For example, China offshore wind policy actually greatly drives the growth of renewable energy, just to point it out. As well as it's best to actually determine beforehand the supply chain abilities of that particular country in order to reduce overall development costs in basically executing the projects.
Excellent.
Yeah, just to build on those comments regarding understanding the regulatory framework, in certain countries in the region, there are obviously limits on foreign investment, so it is critical to have and develop a trusted relationship with local partners. In the Philippines, for example, foreign investors can't hold more than 40% ownership in solar and wind farms. It depends on the nature of the renewable energy project, what the limitation is. In Indonesia, there are limits where the project size is under 10 megawatts, which can obviously be quite common where you're developing smaller scale or a portfolio of renewable energy projects. And other markets like Vietnam, where even though as a foreign investor you can have 100% ownership, it may not be in your best interest to proceed alone without a local partner.
Excellent, Bree. Thank you very much for that. Guys, we are reaching our 30 minutes. We do have a question in which I think we should take, because it's I believe it's quite important. The question that's come in is, what are the opportunities for electrical energy storage? Who would like to take that?
Yeah, I mean, let me quickly take that one. I know we're kind of out of time. You know, there are players. You know, we had a BritCham event just in December where GE were talking about their storage and hybrid solutions. So there's a number of players who are looking at storage. I think people are starting to build storage into their models, and you know, storage covers a whole bunch of different areas, of course, you know, from battery all the way to hydro. But storage is happening here in the region, and is something that should definitely be built in. So for our storage companies, you know, get in touch, because, you know, we'll be able to place you, you know, with the right opportunities.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tim. Well, as I said, we have reached our 30 minutes. We do have another couple of questions, and we'll forward those to you so that you can come back to the audience there and answer those questions. I just wanted to thank all of you. Thank you very much, Tim, Nashina, and Bree, for your input in today's webinar, and I hope that's been useful to you. And certainly we have an opportunity, I think, to steer some organisations towards you from today's webinar who would like to know a lot more information from you on how they could access these opportunities in ASEAN. So thank you very much, guys, for that. We have reached the end of our webinar, so I'd like to thank all the attendees for logging in. I hope that has been useful to you. Just to remind you that we do have another webinar, conversational webinar, which is on the 25th of March. We will be doing that with Santander UK. We'll be talking about their international offering for export-ready SMEs, and probably doing a live demonstration of their trade portal, and looking towards a trade club and how they can help companies into market. So that is the end of our webinar, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one on the 25th of March. In the meantime, thank you very much and have a good day.